Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into the Progressive era. Think early 20th century America, a time of huge change, lots of upheaval, especially with industrialization really taking hold.
Absolutely. And the core idea driving a lot of reformers back then, roughly 1901 to 1912, was this need to, well, strengthen the state, to actually use the government to help people make things fairer.
Yeah, an agency of human welfare, as they put
Cool.
it, because you had massive problems, right? We're talking huge monopolies, political bosses running cities, corruption, social inequality.
Exactly. And America was changing fast. 76 million people and almost 1 in 7 born outside the U.S. So this diverse group, the progressives, they were targeting all that stuff. The trusts, the graft, the inefficiency, the injustice.
And the president, who really stamped his personality on this era, at least nationally, was Theodore Roosevelt,
Yeah.
TR. He came in talking about a square deal.
Right. A square deal for everyone, business, workers, the public. His big thing was fairness. He famously said there should be no crookedness in the dealing. Not guaranteeing success, but a fair shot.
So today, we'll trace where this whole reform impulse came from. We'll look at those journalists, the muckrakers who exposed so much. Then TR's big three ideas.
Yeah.
Controlling corporations, protecting consumers, and conserving resources.
And we have to get into the big blow up within the Republican Party. That split really paved the way for the fascinating 1912 election. It's quite a story.
Okay, let's start with the roots. This progressive movement didn't just pop up overnight. It built on earlier stuff, yeah.
Oh, definitely. You can see threads going back to the greenback labor folks in the 1870s and certainly the populists in the 1890s. But the really big shift, philosophically, it was moving away from pure laissez-faire.
The whole hands-off government idea.
Exactly. For a long time, that was the dominant thinking. But by 1900, the problems, poverty in the cities, the sheer power of corporations, they were just too complicated. The old, weak government structures couldn't handle it. Progressives basically said, we need to manage this, not just drift. Government had to step up.
And you had writers pointing this out early on, like Henry Damaris Lloyd going after Standard Oil way back in 1894, or Thorstein Veblen, I love his phrase, attacking conspicuous consumption.
Yes, in the theory of the leisure class, he was really critical of the wealthy elite. But maybe the one who hit the hardest, especially in terms of public awareness and influencing TR himself, was Jacob Riis.
Ah, how the other half lives. The photos.
Exactly. Published in 1890, it wasn't dry economics. It was this shocking look at the slums in New York, the filth, the disease, just the human misery. Roosevelt was police commissioner in New York then, and Riis's work deeply affected him. It showed how powerful just seeing the problem could be.
And there were other forces pushing this way too. The social gospel movement, for example, using religious ideas to push for better conditions.
Right. And women were becoming incredibly active, not just fighting for the vote, but pioneers like Jane Addams at Hull House or Lillian Wald. They were linking social justice directly to women's roles in society, tackling urban problems head on.
Which kind of sets the scene for the journalists who blew the lid off things, starting around 1902, the muckrakers, as TR called them.
Yeah, Roosevelt actually coined that term in 1906. It wasn't entirely a compliment, He compared them to a character in Pilgrim's Progress who could only look down at the muck and filth, never up.
But the work they did, magazines like McClure's, Cosmopolitan, they published some bombshell stuff.
Absolutely undeniable. Lincoln Steffens, for instance, with The Shame of the Cities. He showed how big business and city governments were often corruptly tied together.
And Ida Tarbell's expose on Standard Oil. Just meticulously researched. Devastating.
Devastating is the right word. Then David G. Phillips argued in The Treason of the Senate that something like 75 out of 90 senators were basically representing the trusts and railroads, not the people. Pretty shocking claim.
You also had people like John Spargo writing about child labor in The Bitter Cry of the Children. Just heartbreaking stuff.
It was. But what's really crucial to understand about the muckrakers and the sources emphasize this is what they were trying to achieve. They weren't revolutionaries trying to overthrow capitalism.
No, they were more like reformers, cleansers.
Exactly. They believed in the system but thought it needed a serious cleaning. Their weapon was publicity. Shine a bright light on the problems, and they believed the public would demand change. The cure for democracy's problems, in their view, was more democracy.
And that idea led directly to changes in how government worked, trying to give average people more power,
Right.
taking it back from the political bosses.
Precisely. They came up with this whole toolkit for direct democracy. Things like the initiative, which let voters actually propose laws themselves.
So you could bypass a legislature that was maybe in the pocket of special interests.
Right. Or the referendum, where voters could vote directly on laws that the legislature passed, and the recall, which allowed voters to kick out officials they thought weren't doing their job properly.
Well, it's the secret ballot, the Australian ballot, to make it harder for bosses to bribe or intimidate voters.
Put together, these really started to shift power back towards the public, at least at the state and local level.
And nationally, the big prize was changing how senators were chosen, getting rid of the system where state legislatures picked them.
Yeah, the Senate was called the Millionaires' Club for a reason. It was seen as beholden to corporate interests. Progressives fought hard for the direct election of senators, and they finally got it with the 17th Amendment in 1913.
We also saw states becoming laboratories of reform. Wisconsin is the classic example under Robert La Follette, Fighting Bob.
He really is the archetype. He took on the big lumber and railroad companies, pushed for regulating utilities, and this was key. He worked closely with experts from the University of Wisconsin to figure out the best policies. That idea of bringing academic expertise into government was very progressive.
You also had figures like Hiram Johnson in California breaking the power of the Southern Pacific Railroad, or Charles Evans Hughes in New York investigating powerful industries.
Yeah, these state-level reformers were crucial. And alongside them, women were finding ways to exert influence even without the vote.
The side door to public life, they called it. Settlement houses like Jane Addams' Hull House became centers of activism.
And women's clubs shifted too. They started focusing less on, literature and more on what they saw as maternal issues, safe food, child labor laws, public health, applying domestic concerns to the public sphere.
This led to some important legal battles, like Florence Kelley and the National Consumers League pushing for better working conditions. And the Mullen v. Oregon case in 1908 seems really significant.
It was huge. Lewin Brandeis, who later became a Supreme Court justice, argued the case. He convinced the court to uphold a law limiting working hours for women. But how he argued it is fascinating and kind of uncomfortable looking back.
How so?
Well, he used a ton of evidence to argue that long hours and factories were uniquely harmful to women because of their weaker bodies and their role as mothers. At the time, it was hailed as a major victory for workers' protection.
But based on an argument about female frailty.
Exactly. So it was progressive protection then, but that same logic would later be used against arguments for full equality. It's a real historical irony.
Wow. That tension is stark. And then you have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. Just horrific.
Truly horrific. 146 workers died, mostly young immigrant women, trapped because the factory doors were locked supposedly to keep them from taking breaks or stealing.
The public reaction must have been immense.
It was a massive shock. It galvanized public opinion and gave reformers the leverage they needed. New York State passed much stronger laws on factory safety, working hours, conditions, and it spurred the push for workers' compensation laws across the country. By 1917, about 30 states had them. That fire was a real catalyst.
And running parallel to all this was the temperance movement, the push against alcohol. Can't forget that.
Absolutely not. Groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, led by Frances Willard, and the Anti-Saloon League were incredibly powerful. They framed alcohol as a major social ill tied to poverty, domestic violence, inefficiency.
And they were effective.
Very. By the time the U.S. entered World War I, something like half the country lived in dry territory states or counties that banned alcohol sales. They laid all the groundwork for national prohibition, the 18th Amendment. It was a huge part of the Progressive Coalition.
Okay, let's shift to the White House. Theodore Roosevelt and his square deal. The 3 C's. First up, control of corporations. How did he tackle the trusts?
Well, he got tested almost immediately with the huge Anthracite Coal Strike in 1902. 140,000 miners walked out, conditions were terrible, and the mine owners were completely refusing to negotiate.
What did TR do?
He called both sides to the White House. When the owners still wouldn't budge, TR threatened something unprecedented. He said he'd use federal troops to seize and operate the mines.
Whoa! Against the owners, not the strikers.
Exactly. That was the first time a president had threatened to use federal power against capital in a labor dispute. It worked. The owners backed down, agreed to arbitration, and the miners got a 10% raise and a 9-hour day, though not formal union recognition. The message was clear. The government, representing the public interest, could intervene.
He also pushed for new government bodies, right?
Yes. He got Congress to create the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903. And within that was the Bureau of Corporations, specifically designed to investigate businesses involved in interstate commerce. It's sort of a watchdog.
And he went after the railroads, too.
Definitely. The Elkins Act in 1903 targeted the railroads, giving secret rebates to favored shippers, which hurt smaller businesses. Then the Hepburn Act of 1906 was even stronger. It gave the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, the power to actually set maximum railroad rates and expanded its authority over things like express companies and pipelines. That was a big step in federal regulation.
So was TR really trying to break up all the big trusts?
His approach was more nuanced, actually. He made a distinction between good trusts and bad trusts. Good ones were, efficient and basically played fair. Bad ones were greedy and predatory. His goal wasn't necessarily to smash every large corporation.
What was the goal then?
It was symbolic, but powerful, to prove that the government was ultimately in charge, not private business. The famous case was the breakup of J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company in 1904. It was a giant railroad monopoly. Breaking it up sent a shockwave through Wall Street. It showed TR was willing to take on the most powerful interests.
Okay, the second C, consumer protection, this one seems directly linked to the muckrakers.
Oh, absolutely. The trigger was Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, in 1906. Sinclair actually wanted to expose the horrible conditions for immigrant workers in the Chicago meatpacking plants.
But people focused on the meat itself.
That's what hit home. TR famously said Sinclair had aimed for the nation's heart but hit it in the stomach. The descriptions of contaminated meat, filth, rats, it literally sickened people, including Roosevelt himself.
I can imagine. So the public demanded action.
Immediately. The outcry was huge. Congress, pushed by TR, responded really quickly that same year with two landmark laws. First, the Meat Inspection Act. It mandated federal inspection of meat shipped across state lines, basically from the slaughterhouse to the consumer.
And the second one?
The Pure Food and Drug Act. This was broader. It aimed to prevent companies from adulterating food, adding fillers or harmful chemicals, and from mislabeling food and drugs. You couldn't just sell snake oil anymore, or at least you had to label it honestly. These were foundational consumer protection laws.
Got it. And the final C, conservation. This is often seen as one of TR's biggest legacies, isn't it?
Without a doubt. He was appalled by how quickly the country was squandering its natural resources, forests, minerals, water. He wasn't the first conservationist, but he used the power of the presidency to make it a national priority.
What were some key actions?
Well, the Newlands Act of 1902 was important. It allowed the federal government to use money from selling public lands in the West to fund large-scale irrigation projects. Think big dams like the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona, making agriculture possible in arid regions.
And setting aside land.
Tons of it. Working closely with Gifford Pinchot, his chief forester, TR set aside something like 125 million acres as federal forest reserves, plus millions more acres of coal deposits and potential water power sites. He dramatically expanded the concept of national parks and reserves.
But there was tension within the conservation movement itself, right? The Hetch Hetchy controversy.
Yes, that really highlighted a fundamental split. Hetch Hetchy was a beautiful valley in California near Yosemite. San Francisco wanted to dam it to create a municipal water supply after the 1906 earthquake.
And some people objected.
Fiercely. He had the preservationists, led by people like John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club. They saw places like Hetch Hetchy as sacred, like a temple that should be preserved untouched, purely for their natural beauty, wilderness for its own sake. Versus the conservationists like TR and Pinchot. Their philosophy was more about multiple-use resource management. They weren't against using natural resources, but they believed it should be done efficiently, scientifically, and sustainably for the public good. To them, Pinchot famously said, wilderness was waste. They believed resources should be managed, not just locked away.
And San Francisco got the dam in the end, right?
They did in 1913, after TR left office. But the fight itself showed this deep philosophical divide: preservation versus managed use that still shapes environmental debates today. It's a core tension.
Okay, so TR leaves office in 1908, having basically picked his successor, William Howard Taft.
Yeah, Taft was his Secretary of War. Seemed like a safe choice to continue TR's policies. He was generally well-liked, experienced, but he just didn't have TR's political instincts or, frankly, his energy for reform. He was more comfortable with the way things were, more wedded to the status quo, as historians put it.
Yeah, things started to unravel for the Republicans under Taft. There was that financial panic in 1907.
Right, the Panic of 1907. Short but sharp. Critics blamed TR's trust-busting for unsettling business, though the causes were more complex. But it did lead to calls for monetary reform. The Aldrich-Vreeland Act in 1908 was a temporary measure allowing banks to issue emergency currency. It kind of paved the way for the bigger reform later, the Federal Reserve System.
Taft also had his own foreign policy approach, didn't he? Dollar diplomacy.
That's right. It was different from TR's big stick approach. Taft's idea was to encourage American bankers, Wall Street, to invest money in strategically important places like Manchuria to counter Japanese and Russian influence, or in the Caribbean.
Using dollars instead of bullets.
Kind of. The hope was that economic influence would promote stability and American interests without needing military intervention. But, ironically, it often led to just that, sending in troops to protect those American investments when things got unstable, like in Nicaragua in 1912.
And Taft actually busted more trusts than TR.
Numerically, yes. Taft's administration brought about 90 antitrust suits, compared to around 44 under Roosevelt. But one of Taft's biggest cases had a very controversial outcome.
Which one was that?
The Supreme Court's decision in 1911 to break up Standard Oil sounds like a progressive victory, right? But in the ruling, the court introduced what's called the rule of reason.
Rule of reason. What did that mean?
It meant that the Sherman Antitrust Act didn't outlaw all restraints of trade, only those that were unreasonable. This made it much harder for the government. Before, they just had to prove a company had a monopoly or restrain trade. Now, they had to prove the company intended to restrain trade unreasonably. Progressives were furious. They felt it seriously weakened the government's ability to fight monopolies.
So that created friction. And then there was specific policy clashes that really drove a wedge between Taft and the progressive wing of the party. The tariff issue.
Yes, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff in 1909. Progressives wanted lower tariffs, but the final bill actually kept many tariffs high, even raised some. Taft signed it anyway, and then made things worse by calling it the best bill that the Republican Party ever passed. That did not go over well with reformers.
And the conservation fight. The Ballinger-Pinchot affair.
That was maybe the final straw for the TR loyalists. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, opened up some public lands in Alaska, including coal fields to private development. Gifford Pinchot, still the chief forester and a close friend of TR's, publicly accused Ballinger of basically giving away national resources.
And Taft sided with Ballinger.
He did. He fired Pinchot for insubordination. To the progressives, and especially to TR, who was hearing about this from afar, it looked like a complete betrayal of the conservation policies they'd fought so hard for. The split was now wide open.
So when Roosevelt comes back from his African safari,
he's hearing all this. He feels his legacy is being dismantled. In 1910, he gives this fiery speech outlining his new vision, the new nationalism. He called for much stronger federal government power to regulate the economy and push for social welfare reforms. It was a direct challenge to Taft's more conservative approach.
and it led to a showdown for the Republican nomination in 1912.
A really bitter fight. The Taft administration controlled the party machinery and basically used, well, steamroller tactics to ensure Taft got the nomination, even though TR had won most of the primaries. Roosevelt and his supporters felt cheated. They walked out.
And formed their own party.
Yep. The Progressive Party, quickly nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, after TR declared he felt as strong as a bull moose. Jane Addams even seconded his nomination. It was quite a moment.
So the 1912 election becomes this amazing four-way contest. You've got Taft for the Republicans, TR for the Bull Moose Progressives. The Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson, who was seen as a strong progressive governor from New Jersey.
And Eugene V. Debs running again for the Socialists. But the real contest was between Roosevelt and Wilson, because they offered two different visions of progressivism. This wasn't just about personality, it was about philosophy.
Let's break that down. TR's new nationalism. What was the core idea?
New nationalism basically accepted that big corporations, big trusts were probably here to stay. Consolidation was a modern reality. So, TR argued you needed an equally powerful federal government to regulate them in the public interest. He called for strong regulatory agencies and also for broad social welfare programs, things like minimum wage, worker protections, even hints of national health care. Government as a powerful manager.
Okay, and how did Wilson's new freedom differ?
Wilson's new freedom was rooted in a different fear. He was wary of concentrated power, whether it was corporate or governmental. His vision was about restoring competition. He wanted to use antitrust laws vigorously, not just to regulate big trusts, but to break them up, fragment them, promote small businesses, entrepreneurship. Government's role wasn't to manage the giants, but to clear the field so the little guy had a chance.
Two competing progressive paths. So what happened?
Well, with the Republican split between Taft and Roosevelt, they basically canceled each other out. Wilson won the election easily in the Electoral College, even though he only got about 41% of the popular vote.
And TR came in second.
Yes, Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party actually beat Taft, which was remarkable for a third party, and Eugene Debs pulled in about 6% of the vote for the Socialists, showing just how widespread the desire for significant change was across the country.
So Wilson wins. But looking back, what's TR's lasting impact from this whole period?
Oh, it's immense. Even though he lost in 1912, he fundamentally changed the presidency. He made it the center of national political life, using what he called the bully pulpit, the big stick of publicity, to shape public opinion and drive policy.
And the square deal itself.
It really set the template for future reforms.
Yeah.
You can definitely see the square deal as the grandfather, so to speak, of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal decades later. That idea that the federal government has a responsibility for economic regulation and social welfare really gets cemented under TR.
He also forced Americans to see the country as a major player on the world stage.
Absolutely. But maybe the most interesting question the era leaves us with is, who exactly were the progressives? It wasn't just one monolithic group.
Right. Were they middle-class people worried about losing status to immigrants and corporations? Were they business leaders trying to stabilize things and avoid radicalism? Were they experts trying to make government more efficient?
The answer seems to be yes. All of the above, in a complex, sometimes contradictory mix. And those underlying tensions, like the Hetch Hetchy debate between preserving nature versus using it rationally, they haven't gone away. They're still with us.
That tension between different goals, different ideas of progress, that seems like the enduring puzzle of the era, something to keep thinking about.
Definitely worth mulling over. It shaped so much of what came next.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.